Now, there's a study published recently, I'll link to it down below, that the top 10 countries in the world with the freest media, 8 of them were monarchies. This is an interesting thing you see. Generally speaking, statistically, monarchies and absolute rulerships tend to actually be the freer countries in the world. See, if you separate the totalitarian democrat and the monarchical hand of God countries in the world, generally speaking, monarchies are the most free. And the particularly unfree totalitarians tend to call themselves people's republics. God. Talking about God makes you sound like an idiot. It makes you sound like a Southern Baptist. We've got all of these morons on the news, on YouTube, talking about God and what God wants you to do. And each one has their own interpretation of the Bible. Each one of them has their own understanding and their own dictatorial understanding of this. But let's talk about the philosopher's God. You see, modern atheism is rejecting the conception of God that we had in the 1800s. And the 1800s was a time renowned for either completely misunderstanding philosophers like Nietzsche, or philosophers that couldn't even begin to comprehend what their forefathers had described, like Hobbes. So if I talk about God, when I talk about God, I'm not talking about the Santa Claus for grown-ups. I'm not talking about that Yahweh with his strong positions on masturbating within the camp versus outside of it, and what we should do with women on the rag. I'm talking about the ineffable, the absolute, that thing that is so much grander than anything we could imagine. The first cause, the mathematical formula that allows other mathematical formulas to exist. That which it allows Gödel Escher Bach to be such a ridiculous, self-proving and self-contradictory book. That grand, inestimable thing. That thing that philosophers, the good philosophers, have demonstrated and know exists. Not the bearded man in the clouds. Not the guy with very strong opinions about how you live your life, in particular. There's a saying that, quite frankly, irritates me when most people say it. But the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he doesn't exist. Well, no. The greatest trick was convincing the world that God didn't exist. You get all of these atheist cult movements, all these arguments, all these 400-page books about how God is such an idiotic concept, and, well, Jesus. I don't believe in that God either. But these people seem completely unable, unwilling, uninterested to study the actual arguments that we had for God. They address the watchmaker argument, they address all this other nonsense for the proletariat, and of course that God doesn't exist. And so Hobbes comes along, 1800s. You know, we've forgotten about God. Nietzsche pointed out that we killed God, we eliminated the concept, so Hobbes comes along and invents the mechanical God. He invents the Leviathan, that thing we must believe in for the sake of society. And where are we now? We're at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is hedons versus dollars. It's pleasure versus pain. It's the materialistic atomization of humankind. It breaks us down into nothing but sense pleasure, sense pain. Statistics, logic, political science. Power, manipulation. Designing the perfect system to create this perfect race of man that has the correct institutions to manipulate and control their desires. And what you wind up with is a logical framework that creates this hedonistic society of consumerism, of cheap sex, of atomization, of humans being interchangeable, humans being objects, humans not being ends in themselves as Kant reacted to it, but as happiness being an end in itself. The exact same logic which justifies the nightclub justifies starving millions of Ukrainians to death for the sake of the USSR. The materialist world, the relativistic world, the world without a God, so we had to build our own. And this God, you can call it Marxism, you can call it communism, you can call it democracy, you can call it free market capitalism. This celebration of the mundane and the base and the complete rejection of anything grander, of the supernatural. They've done such a great job proving that ghosts don't exist. And they call that the supernatural. They ignore the philosophical concept of the supernatural, of the thing beyond mathematics, beyond thought. You see, when you get right down to it, and I suppose I'm being a very bad atheist, a very lapsed atheist saying this, the material world doesn't make sense. It has flaws in its theory. Flaws that they knew 1,000 years ago, and that philosophers wrote about. But you don't read those philosophers anymore. They aren't celebrated. They aren't put in the media. So, we're told that these Southern Baptists, these snake handlers and faith healers, these idiots and magicians, these horoscopes, these astrologists, what a silly bunch of people they are. We know the world is nothing but vibrating atoms bouncing against each other. And that we've completely discovered mathematics. Everything is math, even though math is unable to contain itself. So you wind up with this world where pleasure and pain, that's everything that exists. There is nothing but pleasure and pain. Why not go on the heroin drip for the rest of your life? Why not kill 1 million people to make 10 million people happy? What's the difference? We're just atomized individuals, bags of carbon and hydrogen and some oxygen and a few trace minerals bouncing around, and none of it matters at the end. Our grand destiny, our heaven on earth, is being plugged into the matrix, reprogrammed to have that permanent Stepford wife grin on our faces. That's their heaven. Because all they can imagine is basic animal pleasure. And ironically, it's the countries that believe that. It's the nations and the ideologies that subscribe to the materialist, utilitarian, hedons over dollars philosophy of life that become the most tyrannical, the most ugly and inhuman, the most base and ugly, while those that believe in the ineffable, those that believe that the monarch is chosen by God, wind up being the most free, the most happy and productive, with the greatest culture and the greatest industry. It's funny, ain't it? Here's another funny thing about life. If you pursue pleasure, if you put physical pleasure, hedonism, as your highest priority in life, if all you do is seek after happiness, you wind up living in misery. While it's those that forego pleasure, it's those that dedicate themselves to what is good, to satisfaction, those that contemplate an ultimate purpose to human life, something great and worthwhile, worth dying for. Despite what John Lennon says, and despite what Lenin says, it's those that are willing to die for something who wind up finding the greatest happiness in life. Somewhere on that miserable road of self-sacrifice and dedication to an ideal, somewhere along there you just fall into the most ridiculously happy situation that you don't even deserve. And those that try and be happy, those that try and measure everything, to treat humanity like atoms, a bunch of statistics to be correlated and measured and controlled and directed, they not only find misery for themselves, they create misery for millions and millions of people. So yeah, folks, I dream of a society that lives for something bigger than itself. And if you want to call that the divine right of monarchs, I suppose I'm a monarchist. And yes, for the record, Dunhill, take care of yourselves.